Welcome to Vital Mentality Radio. I'm your host, Angel Munro. We're talking all things health and wellness, and we're looking at ways to live a vital life. Short disclaimer, this is not intended as medical advice. This is just for general purposes only. So I think I'm going to call this episode "Do Carbs Make You Fat? Lessons from Vietnam." I'm not entirely sure. But I recently went to a coastal town in Vietnam. My oldest son has moved there for a little while. And people were generally looked very healthy there, but there were things about their diet that were in contradiction to a lot of what modern nutrition says. So I thought it was really a good topic to pick apart a little bit. I didn't think while I was there, I'm going to copy their diet exactly and bring it back here. But what was glaringly obvious to me was that seasonality, climate, and most importantly, the sun really dictates what food you should be eating and how you can metabolize food. So, and I think that there's actually quite a lot of science to back that up, because especially if you look online, there's just constant arguments around what the perfect diet is. You know, you get carnivores saying you should never eat carbohydrates, and vegetables have all these anti-nutrients in them. And then you get people saying, no, you should be eating fiber maxing and you should be having, protein, lots of fiber, and small amounts of fat. I mean, the different dogmatic kind of diets that are out there is crazy. And I think one of the reasons why different people swear by different diets working for them actually does have a lot to do with the climate that they're in. Someone who's in a hotter climate can actually metabolize a lot more carbohydrates and a lot more sugar and a lot more fruit than someone that lives in a cold climate. So, in terms of anti-nutrients, I've written about that fair bit. You can see on my website, but there's more coming. But the thing with anti-nutrients is you can't look. So I'm talking about things like phytates and goitrogens and phytoestrogens, like a lot of the kind of demons that are touted, especially with the carnivore diet, from eating, plant-based food and vegetables. The problem with these so-called anti-nutrients is that you can't actually see them under a microscope. You can't look at a cabbage and see a goitrogen, or you can't look at a legume and see a phytate. To find any of these, they blend them up, centrifuge them, add chemicals in one process, and then in another step add another chemical, in another step add another chemical, and then in some circumstances they'll have to put it on a resin and then take it off again. There are so many steps and so many chemicals added, and then to see it under a microscope, there's, depending on how small this substance is said to be, they use different kinds of microscopes, like an electron one, for example. And so they then have to prepare it with more chemicals and more heavy metals. So it by no means represents what's in the plant. And this is then what they do their testing on. So I'm not convinced that these anti-nutrients even exist. And that's a little bit of a preamble just to show that when we start looking at the minutiae of like what makes food healthy, I think we get really, really lost. And, as you'll see as we go along, I think going off the climate and the sun and location actually gives us a lot more information than any of that can ever give us. So let's dive into what was working for them in Vietnam and, how their life was actually lived. So their diet actually included a lot of sugar and a lot of carbohydrates. In terms of food, There's lots of rice noodles, lots of rice paper, banh mi, so lots of baguettes and lots of rice and protein, primarily pork, chicken, seafood, I think. And because it was so hot, lots of drinks that had sugar in it, like the Vietnamese black coffee in Vietnam is made really strong and really sweet. And a lot of the drinks, like the fresh drinks that they make, have sugar in them. So soda with lemon and sugar, or soda with passion fruit and sugar, or there's sugarcane juices or coconut, plenty of coconuts to drink. So there wasn't a lot of sweets, but there was a lot of sugary drinks throughout the day. And because it's so hot and you sweat so much, you definitely need it. They don't have a lot of desserts. Desserts are primarily actually not very sweet, and they would have, things like coconut milk and legumes and tapioca jelly and stuff like that, and even tofu in them. But yeah, that's so there's not actually a lot of fat in the diet. I mean, there is still fat in the diet, but I would say, because you don't get a lot of energy out of protein, you really need either fat or carbohydrate as your energy source. And I would say the major energy source that they're getting would be from carbohydrates. And everyone was eating in terms of fruit that was included in desserts, everything was seasonal. It wasn't, things aren't getting shipped in from everywhere. People are eating the fresh fruit that's from that area. And the other thing to note about sugar is that it grows in abundance there. Rice grows in abundance there. So it makes sense that they eat those things in abundance because that's the area that they're in. Now, like I said, it was a coastal town, and the days when I was there anyway were quite long. The sun's kind of coming up at 5 o'clock and probably not going down till like 7 or 8. And locals were at the beach early. Like by the time it hit 7 o'clock, the beach was kind of empty. People were getting up at sunrise. They're at the beach. They're grounding. They're getting sunlight in their eyes. No one's wearing sunglasses. They're getting sun directly in their eyes. And there is a lot of science around metabolism and light, particularly getting first morning light. Getting morning light to your eyes and on your skin as the sun rises before you have any blue light, any screens or anything like that. It regulates glucose. It shifts like lipids, so fat metabolism, and means that you have more fat metabolism during the day. And it also regulates hunger. So you're not overeating. And there was a 2024 Nature review that found that this is the case. Like it is a significant marker for metabolizing glucose, and so carbohydrates and fat is from just that simple thing, from having light on your eyes and in your skin in the morning, first thing before any other form of light. And there was another, I'm going to link all of these, by the way. There was another study where 54 adults were tracked with actual wrist monitors that measured their light exposure and their food logs. And the major indicator for people's BMI, like their body mass index or their weight going up, was light, exposure to natural light, not food. Not food, was light. So basically, the less sunlight that you're getting, and the less morning light you're getting, independent calories obviously matter. They do matter, but independent of calories in and calories out. If you're not getting substantial light, then your weight will go up. There was a scientist called Walter Kempner, and he developed a diet called the rice diet. And over 17,000 patients were observed doing this diet, where there was a whole lot of carbohydrates in there and not a lot of fat. And everyone basically lost weight. So, you know, this idea that carbs make you fat is kind of unfounded. Now, if you have too much energy intake from fats or carbs or both, and you're not getting the right light signals and you're not moving your body enough and you're just basically overindulging, then absolutely anything could make you gain weight. Either fats or carbs, or even too much protein could. Too much intake of energy, as opposed to what's being expended, can make you put on weight. So, but the importance of like breaking this down is the kind of demonization of certain foods is what I'm saying is unfounded. And like I said before, it's definitely dependent to some extent of where you live. Another scientist, Philip Randle, in the 60s, I think it was 63 maybe, he developed what he called the Randle Cycle. And his hypothesis or theory was basically you can either process carbohydrates or you can process fats as your energy source. Like I said, protein kind of fuels muscles and is involved in like lots of other enzymatic kind of processes in the body. But in terms of an energy source, you either use carbohydrates or you use fats. And in Western cultures, we generally, have a lot of both, which could explain why people, overweight and obesity is a big problem. But what he was saying is that people should be having one or the other. And what I think is missing from that conversation, because some people swear that the Randle cycle is what people should be following, one or the other. And basically, the argument is that basically if you were to do use carbohydrates as your major source, then it would be like a plant-based vegan diet. And if you were to use fat as your primary source, it would be more of a carnivore diet. And people say, after a certain amount of time doing the carbohydrate as the primary source, that you miss out on other nutrients. So that's where the carnivore people will say, so that means therefore that the carnivore diet is the best diet because it's the only one that's sustainable. And I think what's missing from this picture is seasonality again. So someone living in Vietnam or, the top of Australia or somewhere like near the equator, they probably are really good on the high carbohydrate diet because they have lots of fruit, they have rice, they have sugarcane, they have these things growing in abundance, and probably animals are faring not as well in those warmer countries as they would in a colder climate. And where I am in Melbourne at the bottom of Australia, that kind of diet isn't really ideal. Sugarcane doesn't grow here, rice doesn't grow here, lots of tropical fruit doesn't grow here. So less carbohydrates and more fats is more favorable. And I think that's a massive, massive missing piece of this whole kind of controversy around what the perfect diet is. Now, another small piece of what I noticed that they were doing in Vietnam is that because their days were so long and it was so hot in the middle of the day, it was a very common place for people to have naps, so much so that even on work sites, there were just spaces, or just along the street, there'd be spaces where they were undercover and there were just rows of hammocks so people could have naps. It's a really big part of the culture. And when you're in a climate that's so hot and the daylight hours are so long, it makes sense that in the hottest part of the day, you should need a rest. And in terms of the science around that, having a nap that's like between 15 minutes and 30 minutes is associated with good weight management. And I think one of the reasons is because it lowers stress, and too much stress actually can make you put on weight. And people talk about cortisol. Again, I don't like talking about isolated kind of hormones and things because of how I explained, it doesn't matter if it's a hormone or if it's a vitamin or an anti-nutrient or any of these things, or peptide or amino acid. The way that they look at them is this massive chemical process. So I think when we're talking about these things, we don't really know what we're talking about because there's no way of us knowing without separating them by adding chemicals. But that's what people say. It's that too much cortisol makes you put on weight. But I think too much stress makes you put on weight. Napping helps. If it's longer than 30 minutes, then it's associated with gaining weight. But all of that's kind of whatever. The reason why I think it's interesting is that they were living so in line with the rhythm of the day. And again, here in Melbourne in winter, a day the sun probably doesn't rise until 7:30 and it's going down by 5:00. So you wouldn't be having a nap here. It's not boiling hot in the middle of the day and you're not tired, so it's not applicable. But what is eating within the window of that day. So eating with the sun. And that is also associated with better weight management. Eating when the sun goes down is like, there's studies on that too, where someone could eat exactly the same meal within sunlight hours to someone who's eating them out of sunlight hours, and the people who are eating out of sunlight hours, their weight is going up. So yeah, the most important part of this is what I noticed in Vietnam is that they were following the sun and they were living in a way that was in accordance with their season. No one was worrying about what Dave Asprey or I don't know, whatever health influencer was saying. They were working with what they had. And to me, it's really the most important part. I'm at the point now where I am only eating food that grows here. I mean, with some exceptions, but where I am, the only fruits that grow here are things like apples, pears, quinces, maybe tamarillos. We get some melons in summer, like watermelon, honeydew, rock melon, some grapes. We get berries. And am I missing something? Passion fruit. That's actually about it, what grows in the state that I live in. So things that I love, like mangoes, bananas, pawpaw, I'm not worried about including pawpaw because it has pepsin in it, or all these things that I was trained when I studied nutritional medicine to think about. I'm not worried about that anymore. I'm worried about eating the food that grows where I live. And then if I happen to go and go some further up in Australia or go to another country and they've got different fruit, then I'll eat it. But the best thing that you can do is eat the food that matches the sun that you're under, and eat in daylight hours. Don't eat too much. And, don't worry about what people are saying. And like I said before, I still eat a little bit of sugar, but it doesn't grow here. So I'm not going to eat as much of it here as I would somewhere else. And when I was in Vietnam, I was having the sugar in the drinks with the soda and the lemon, or the soda and the passion fruit. And I was having the coffee with the sugar in it. And I didn't put on weight. And, it was long, hot, sweaty days, and it worked, but it doesn't work here. So anyway, I think I've covered everything. Food for thought, though. If you are confused about what you should be eating, follow the sun in your area, look at what's growing around at that time, and sure, include some foods, especially somewhere like where I live, where it gets cold for months and not a lot is growing, of course. But, in those kind of circumstances, you would rely on things that store well, like apples here. You harvest in autumn, but you can eat them because they store well all the way through winter. And, that makes sense. But me eating a banana all year round, where they never grow here, they only grow in the top of Australia, that's not necessarily the right food for me. So, yeah, I think that is the best guide for basing your diet, what is around you. Thanks for listening. Until next time, see you later.